Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to the August edition of the Carrier's Edge monthly webinar. My name is Mark Murrell, and today I am joined by Rick and Tiffany to talk about content. Tiffany, our content team lead, and Rick, who was previously in the content team before moving over to marketing. And we are going to talk about deconstructing a course, or the process for creating a course. This is something that is always a bit of magic as far as I'm concerned. I've been involved in e-learning since before it was called e-learning, and I still do not really get how people figure it out, how we go from somebody saying, oh, we need a course on this, to a complete course that actually teaches people something. So the last time we did one of these sessions talking about the content side of the business, we looked at regulatory courses, and they present their own challenges in that they are dense and often full of legalese. It's always organized in exactly the wrong way. But in some ways, they're actually easier because they've spelled out everything that needs to be covered. The trick when you get to non-regulatory stuff is figuring out what we should actually be including and what is the right information. With the regs, you know what the regs are because they're written down. But when we're doing something that isn't regulatory, how do we decide what to include and what is actually right? Because everybody has their own opinions on it. So that's what we're going to focus on today. So I've brought in two of the experts to help us go through a little bit of the process for putting together a course, a non-regulatory course. And in this particular case, we're going to use as an example, distracted driving, which has some established best practices, but still evolves over time and needs to be built and rebuilt and updated. So we've got a lot to go through there. So welcome, Tiffany and Rick.
Thank you.
And I also neglected to do the opening housekeeping bit, but by now everybody knows all of that. This is a Zoom meeting. It's being recorded. You'll get a copy of the recording afterwards. Everybody is muted and your cameras are turned off. But if you have a question or something you're curious about, by all means, use the chat to ask us or unmute yourself and ask the question. If you're not asking a question, please keep yourself muted just so that we keep the background noise to a minimum. So there we go, housekeeping out of the way. So we were talking a little bit when we were planning this about the sort of the process of the course and what we do. And it just so happens that in content, a new workflow diagram has been created in our documentation system. So I'm going to share that with everybody as a starting point. So this is the basic workflow for creating a new English course. And this doesn't include translation or regional variations or things like that. This is the workflow that we go through in the process that gets followed from the point where we start a course until we complete it. Now, we've only got an hour today. We're not going through all of these things in detail. There's a lot here, but I did want to show this as a starting point, just to give you a sense that there's a lot of different steps that all fit together in very particular ways. And again, beyond my ability to really comprehend the specifics. So we will rely on Tiffany and Rick to share some of that with us. So let's start with the very beginning. When somebody says, let's do a course on X, okay, distracted driving as our example, how do you decide what you're going to put in that course and where to go with it? So Tiffany, you've spent a lot of time doing this. So where do you start?
Well, first, it depends on if we already have a course on that or something similar that we're going to be revamping or refreshing. Sometimes we'll do that with our old content. So that's the first point, to see if we have something that can be used as a base. And then from there, it's really just about researching. And I'm the kind of person that likes to learn everything I can about a subject, and even kind of go into the weeds a little bit too far, just to make sure that you really grasp the concepts, what's important. And sometimes I find doing almost not too much research, but doing an abundance of research can help you identify really what is the most important things, because you're going to see them cropping up in different places.
So part of that is going to a bunch of different sources then and looking for the common elements.
Exactly. So if it is a regulatory course, we're obviously always going to start with the regulations, but there's lots of great resources out there other than regulatory info. So especially for something that might have some legal aspects, law firm websites are a really great resource, and they can also really help clarify regulatory information. And obviously we want to get industry perspective to learn about what's actually important to the driver, what's going to be important day to day. And so the news articles, websites, driver forums are really important for us to research. And we love YouTube. Can't say enough about YouTube, especially for hands-on things that you just can't find in other places.
Yeah. Yeah, I always find it interesting going to the driver boards to see what their discussions are about on these subjects, because they'll have their own opinions that are, sometimes not exactly what you want to convey in a course, but they do give a really nice real world perspective on the implications of the things that we're going to tell people.
And the comments under news articles are really helpful for that as well.
Yeah, within reason. Yeah. So, okay. And then if you're starting with a course that has existed before, like distracted driving, so then you have to look at what's there and then figure out, what parts of it you want to keep, what you want to add to it. So how do you go about that?
Rick, do you want to do that one, since you recently revamped the distracted driving?
I absolutely can. To go just kind of slightly off script for a second, because I've been thinking a lot about particularly you, Tiff, as a model of getting into the weeds and kind of exhausting yourself in knowing everything about a given topic. And that doesn't happen just when a course is getting built. It actually it's part of kind of a departmental orientation before that. Like how do we know what to decide on, which courses need to be made? And sometimes it is a regulatory one, right? New regulatory change, we've got an old one, we've got to update it. That one's easy. But then there's all sorts of, well, as we do in marketing, industry listening, right? And so you're always attending like webinars. Like you'll text me like, there's this new thing coming up, and all right, let's see what's going on. And we do regular news monitoring, and just kind of keeping our finger on the pulse. And so when you think of, those documentaries on Netflix, like about black holes, right? They're beautiful, they're gorgeous, and they have experts, and they're talking about it. And you could learn a lot about that, and they're these kind of beautiful mini courses. But none of that can happen until much before that someone has pointed an antenna at the sky and started collecting data. And so in many ways, the department is like, it's always got its antenna focused wide, what's going on in the industry, and then we decide on a course, the antenna gets narrow, and then we restart pulling that in. So with distracted driving, we already had that, so that antenna was already focused. And so then we can go back into those resources that you were talking about. Law firm websites are really, really good ones, but there are regulatory bodies, and then there are, I guess, consultative bodies. So the Governor Highway Safety Association, right? They don't actually make regulations, but they're involved in really broad-based analyses and funding research to look at a given topic. And so they had a big report come out must have been middle of last year, specifically on distracted driving, and what is the most up-to-date assessment on what's going on with that problem. And so getting really deep into those, you can then take what's being talked about now and put what the old course through that lens and see what should stick, what should be updated, and what needs to go.
So that's an interesting point, that like even deciding what courses need to be overhauled comes from a little bit of sort of industry listening. Is that it's not just we sort of pick them out of a hat. We're paying attention, and even after that course goes live, you're paying attention to what's happening in the industry to see when it's time to update it and refresh it and things like that. But one of the challenges is that you're also learning the content as well, and that can sort of skew how you approach it. So talk about that. So Rick, your experiences when you're sort of learning the content and how that creates a challenge when you're trying to write a course about it.
Right. So I mean, part of my background is in research, and so that part wasn't as difficult, happily, to dive into all those things. But in building courses, one of the best bits of advice I ever got was, just because you're excited about something new that you learn doesn't mean drivers need to know it. So you've got to have that lens on. And as you start pulling things together, you start to get a sense of what you want your learning objectives to be. And that there's a kind of iterative process there, right? You get to start to get a sense of learning objectives, and then that's going to focus a little bit on the other things that you research on. Maybe those don't quite fit, and you tweak it depending on what you find, and then you sort of move forward from there. And once you sort of get your learning objectives, then you can really settle in and start to construct.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Tiffany, how do you manage that process?
I would say similarly, but adding on to what Rick said, when you're defining your learning objectives and you're doing the research, I find looking for the common problems with that subject. So what people are experiencing, what the issues are, and what we really need to communicate in the course. That's sort of the guiding pillars for it. And then, especially when we're working with old content, I like to read through it and, as Rick said, look at it from today's perspective. So what is irrelevant? What don't we need anymore? But also what's unclear to me as a learner, and where do I think that something needs to be expanded upon? So if I'm not understanding it, or if I think something's vague, that's an area that I'm going to research more and build out more in the next version.
Interesting. One of the things that I find when you look at, and you probably see this as a team lead reviewing other people's work, when they first get into the task of building courses, they start learning it. And one of the hallmarks of somebody who's kind of green in that area is that they've got this great summary of all the information at the end of their storyboard, at the end of the course, because they finally understand it all. And they put that right at the end of their course. And one of the first things you do when editing and sort of reviewing that is say, okay, no, this overview really should be at the beginning. So go back and sort of reorganize your stuff. Is when people are just learning it, they tend to organize it in the way they learn versus basing it on a logical flow of the objectives. So that must be a challenge for you at being always watching that when you're writing your own stuff, right?
Yeah, and it's something that I've been trained well in now. So when I'm learning something, I'll write, and obviously I leave it for a few days to come back to it with fresh eyes. I find that incredibly helpful. And now I know to look at the end of my section, whether it's a section or the end of a lesson, to see if I have put the most important piece of information at the bottom. And if I have, then I'll take it and stick it at the top.
Okay. And then once you get that content and you get it organized and you figure out what needs to be in there, we need to actually write out the storyboard and write out the words. But it isn't just a piece that's going to be read. We have voiceover that we have to consider as well. So, Rick, you did a lot of writing before you came in here, and probably not that much of it was written for voiceover. So what were the challenges that you saw when you had to sort of approach, think about somebody reading it, the narration?
Yeah. My the writing that I had been used to had a lot of what I would call redundant clarification. So you would state your idea, then restate it, then come up with an analogy, explain the two ways that could be misinterpreted, fix that, and then restate it again, and suddenly you're 10 pages in, and that's just not going to work. And so being able to take these ideas reflected through the learning objectives, and then kind of imagine them as being presented or almost performed with our voice actors. You kind of just have to sit back and actually say it out loud. You've got to like talk it out. What's this actually going to sound like? And if it sounds stiff to you, well, it's going to sound stiff when it actually gets done. The nice thing is, I get the best part of my job is I get to work with a lot of really smart and talented people, and so I can send things to them who have better eyes than I do. And Tiff will take something that I've written and she's like, the content's great, but listen to the way this sounds. And so all these people are like, okay, massage it again, try this out. And so this is another element of that sort of iterative process on the team.
Yeah, I noticed that as we're working on kind of the marketing writing, and it's little things like when do we use contractions versus full length versions of words, and when do we actually follow the formal grammatical rules versus intentionally skirting them a little bit to make something flow a little bit nicer. And so, yeah, Tiffany, you've got a lot of experience in getting that stuff to flow and have the right tone. Are there particular things that you think about when you're writing it to make it flow nicely?
Yes, the first is always to use active voice, and not only does it flow. So if you haven't heard that term before, there's active voice and passive voice. And active voice explains who is doing what. So, for example, Jeremy walks the dog. So we clearly know who is doing the action and what he's doing. But passive voice is something is done by somebody else. So the dog is being walked. Well, that leads to a lot of ambiguity, and it also just sounds more formal and stiff as opposed to just a casual conversation like Jim's walking the dog or the dog is being walked. It sounds very stiff, and it also leads you to ask, well, who's doing that? So that helps with flow and comprehension of the text. And then on our content team, we also have a style guide. So there's certain things that we should do and shouldn't do to keep things consistent and to stop you from straying from that conversational tone, as well as keeping our word count down. That's something that can also help with voiceover, because we tend to write much longer sentences than we would naturally say. There's more breaks when we're speaking naturally. Yeah,
it's easy to keep typing, but it's a lot different when you have to say it without a breath. So then it does force you to shorten it a little bit, but also we have to pay attention to the level of writing, right? Rick, you were talking about a much more dense style of writing. It's more of sort of a post-secondary approach, or the master's thesis approach to writing, which is technically correct and it's accurate and it is not needing any further clarification, but it's also not very fun to read. So we've got to kind of balance that. But we don't want to be writing at a level that seems like it's for elementary school. We have to find a balance in there that is easy to read and has some flow to it, but also gives us enough space to say what needs to be said. So are there particular tricks that you both use when writing to make sure it's at their particular level, that it's not too dense, but also not too simplistic?
I think we write a lot of our courses in story, and that I find is very helpful for keeping not a conversational tone, but the right level of information and just the right level of writing, because you're telling a story about somebody and you want to make that person, you want to make the learner connect with that person. So you want to almost make them be your friend. So you're going to use the kind of language that you would use when you're talking to your friend. So you're not going to necessarily dumb it down, and you're not going to try to make yourself sound smarter than you are. You're just going to speak like you would to a good friend, and that's going to tell the story in a natural way and keep it at that level. I find that's
an interesting point.
Yeah.
I find a lot of people that are writing, particularly safety content, do seem to think that they have to write in a particular way to have authority, and they will be very pedantic in their language or overly formal or try and kind of elevate it a little bit. But the most effective content is in a conversational style that's written the way you would talk. And so, yeah, I think, Rick, going back to your point about the importance of actually saying it, saying that stuff and reading those things, then you realize this doesn't sound like anybody talks. And you get the voiceover recording back, and Craig works very hard on the voiceover recordings, but sometimes it's really rough for him to say things in a conversational way. And so we do have to work on that.
Yeah, and having that.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say you're not going to want to have, furthermore or in so much as that. Those
Yes.
things that come at the beginning of sentences, you can pretty much just chop those right out, and it'll make it be a lot more accessible for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the importance of that story and those characters, it if you're paying attention, it effectively blocks you from just taking a large chunk of your research and plonking it in as if someone were saying it, right? If you've got a believable character, he's not going to turn around and rattle off all these 15 regulatory points. Like, it doesn't work.
Well, that's another good point, is that it's very easy for people to just grab content and sort of copy and paste it. And if you're turning it into a story, you really can't do that, right? If you're writing it in a particular way, you can't do that. So we focus, as a company, we focus a lot on writing it in clear language that is also our own words. So we're not using anybody else's stuff. And so that also drives how you write the specifics of the content in there. So yeah, and you talked about sort of thinking about the words and space and things like that, but you also have to consider translation, because nearly every course that we do is going to end up translated into some other language. So how does that affect the thinking about the writing?
Well, you need to slash out a bunch of content. And I am very guilty for it too. You're going to write it because you're processing and thinking as you're writing. And then you need to take a break, come back and review it. And there's a good chunk of information that you can take out. So there's lots of filler words that you'll find if you're looking for them. Just like I said, things like furthermore, which you may not use often, but there'll be little words that make sentences longer. It's those filler words add up to a lot. So going back through and cutting those down, and sometimes like Rick mentioned, sometimes you'll add information because you think it's important because it helped you understand it, but it might not be necessarily needed to get the point across. And for those, I find it really, really essential to have somebody else review it. So when I go through, I try to do that as well, but it really needs another set of eyes to catch those things that aren't needed to get the point across. So it's good, it's there, it's supplementary information, but it might be more important to you than it is to somebody else.
Right. Which kind of leads into the challenges of editing your own.
Part about translation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Rick.
Yeah, with translation, I mean, if anyone has ever seen an English and a French sign, French just takes up more room, right? Because of the structure of the language. And so if you've got a page set up and it's pretty full of English text, guess what's going to happen when you translate it to French? So you always got to have sort of one eye on that as well.
Yeah, and Spanish is similar. It takes up more space, and sometimes it's not just that there are more words, but sometimes the words are longer. So that flows entirely differently on the page.
Or there's not a word and they need to come up with a way to explain it, which takes many words.
Yeah. And so all of that we've been talking about so far is really just about figuring out what content we're going to cover and writing the words to go through it. But that's only half of the course. We haven't even got to the visual or the interactive side yet. So let's move around and talk about that for a little bit. And I know, Rick, you've got some things that you're going to show to go through it a little bit. But as you're writing the stories, you're not just thinking about how to explain these things in words. You're also thinking about how to showcase them, how to demonstrate them, what kind of things work. Is it a photo? Is it a graphic? Is it a process? Or are we doing an animation? All of those things. So talk a little bit about that process. And yeah, well, let's look at it through the context of distracted driving, where we've got some driving things and we've got a variety of other things that we wanted to include. So what was your process of figuring out what kind of interactivity and graphics you wanted to include there, Rick?
So the distracted driving course was really the time when I had become sort of comfortable enough with like the principles of building a course, and I got a little more of a chance to play. And when you're talking about something like being distracted, there are a whole bunch of different ways that you can challenge your audience to really get their heads around that idea. So for one, let's see if I can pull it up here. I don't know if we can see that.
Yep, we've got that there.
So this is one of the pages, and I was struggling with getting the reader, the audience, to experience what it is I was talking about rather than just reading about it. And I came up with this idea, and I floated it, and I honestly didn't think people were going to say it was okay. But we got the green light, and then some very smart people were able to actually make the magic happen. So as you're reading this, you're reading through, talking about different kinds of distraction, and then suddenly
You have
a
the spider
spider
come across.
goes across your screen. And in this text here, as it's read out loud, as it says, you're reading and you're trying to listen to this, but you are absolutely distracted.
Right.
And so this is kind of a different way of getting towards your learning objectives. Now, one thing I did learn is that when you have a course with something like that in it, and you move it through different departments for quality assessment, you should warn them. And I'm sorry, Divya, we didn't warn you that spider was in there, but yeah, that's
yeah. Our QA had got a little bit of an unpleasant surprise,
right.
but it worked, right? But that was part of the objective, is to find ways to show the content in different ways that it becomes sticky and people think about it and they really start to get behind what you're talking about. So
correct. In another case, we'll pull this back.
Yes.
You remember this, Tiff? The Stroop test.
Right.
Yeah, so this is a fixture of distraction courses, is understanding how the brain processes things and the cognitive workload and all of those challenges.
Right.
So to build this in as well. So yeah, what was your process here?
Right. So a much earlier version of the Stroop test occurred in sort of the old distracted driving course, and it was okay. It was okay, but we needed it updated, and we knew the value of it because the idea behind it is you see the word and you are supposed to express which color the letters are in. Of course, it's blue. There, it's orange. Those letters are green, orange.
Yeah, now you've committed to it. You have to finish.
Yeah, I really do. It's just
yeah.
But what happens in round 2 is the word says brown, but I'm supposed to click orange because the letters are orange. And so this is going to slow you down as you're now trying to focus on two things. Part of your brain is reading the word, part of your brain is trying to figure out, okay, no, I'm not supposed to use the color of that. And again, like that. So this was a great way of getting the interactivity, and again, getting the audience and the reader to sort of come face to face with the difficulties of actually being distracted and experiencing that. And so this there were technical elements in getting these in the course, but
well, that was
I think
ultimately
my
my follow-up
question
is it's one thing to have the idea, it's another thing for the design group to create the visuals, but there's also that technical element that it needs to work, and it needs to work for everybody, and it needs to be something that is actually reliable and improving the experience rather than working on some devices and being unworkable on others. So are there things that you follow as you're going through that? How do you make sure that you're designing interactions that are going to work everywhere?
Yeah. So in that workflow chart that you shared earlier, at the very beginning had the words kickoff, right? So where you first sort of plant your flag, this is the course we're going to do. And then halfway along, there was another one called the handoff. And the handoff is where The writer is going to express what they had in mind, sort of broadly speaking, and then very specifically across various elements as it moves to other departments, whether that's graphics or you need help with platform. And along the way, you just ask, like we are, as a series of departments, we're not siloed. We're all sort of, we all know each other, we all work well together. And if you have an idea, as I've discovered, like, what about this thing? There's someone who's going to have an answer, and even more so, there's someone who's going to be able to do it. So when we came up with a spider, I said, what if we had a spider? And sure enough, people smarter than me made the spider happen, and the Stroop test, and then there's another element in there. And so if you're lucky enough to work with good people, they're able to take your ideas and make them live. But you got to have that ongoing ability to have those conversations, and somehow they just kind of make the magic happen.
Okay. Yeah, Tiffany, you've done that for a bunch of different courses as well, come up with some different characters. And I think we talked in the February or an earlier webinar, we talked about why you use certain characters in defensive driving, where you sort of did the graphic novel kind of thing. So, and now for dangerous goods, we've also got a different sort of interaction where you've got like a clue game happening. So you've got obviously got some very creative ideas of how to present the content. Are there things that you find that always work, or things that you go to, or I mean, how do you come up with some of these things?
Yes, my favorite thing, and I preach it all the time, is to use hotspots, which is where we take an image, just a regular 2D image of something, and put little circles or buttons on it. And I really find that's a great way to avoid using bullet points, and it makes the image come alive, and it makes the content come alive as well. That's one of my favorite things to do. It's pretty simple to implement on our system, at least. It doesn't require anything fancy, just a 2D image and some buttons.
Okay. So, and that goes into, we sort of glossed over the actual building, that we've got a whole system where we build these courses together. We take the words, we assemble them, we put each of the pages together, and then we have to bring in the design group. That's the handoff that you're talking about, Rick, where we bring in the design group to start talking about what they're doing or what we want them to do and how they can support it. And they have to be working in this system as well. So are there things that you've found that are particularly useful to sort of convey to the design group what you're after? I mean, they start coming up with different looks for every course in some ways. So how does that come about?
Sometimes, so it sort of depends. If I have a very specific idea in mind, I'd like to do a mock-up. So I'll do it in Word. Sometimes Word has good diagrams, especially for if I'm trying to come up with a scheme of something, or Adobe Illustrator, just to do something very rough. Or even in our system, I'll take an image and try to doctor it as best as I can, so they get the idea of what I'm trying to present. And I find our graphics team is excellent, though. It can really take the essence of something and make it, they can take a lump of coal and turn it into a diamond.
Yeah, and I noticed for some courses, I think it was emotional intelligence, starts with sort of a button look that's very chaotic, and then by the end of it gets very organized as people start to understand.
That's distracted driving, actually.
Distracted, okay. So I knew there was one course where it starts very sort of scattered, and then it gets refined. There's a lot of subtleties like that. And that's a nice creative touch that's going to be very subtle, and I think a lot of people aren't necessarily going to pick up on it consciously, but it really helps to underscore that point. So yeah, that's a really nice addition there. So that happens, I guess at that point, it's the content team and the creative that are sort of working together to put all of the pieces together. And that's assembling each of the pages for these courses and doing all of the visuals. And that's quite a chore because there's an awful lot of them. Some of these courses can be pretty lengthy, right? Yeah. So
and there's a lot of trust actually in there too, because yes, you could have a very clear sense of like, on this page, I need a truck doing this exact thing. Cool. But when you're looking at a sort of a broader mood, like this is the kind of feeling that I'm going to capture. Trust that your graphics people, who by necessity know more than you, are going to be able to say, actually, if we do this other thing over here, you're going to get that same thing. So being able to sort of be open to that creative process and let them do their thing, and you'll end up getting something more than you ever thought you would.
Yeah, that's cool. Let's keep an eye on the clock here. Let's move along to the other part of it that comes after this. Is we've presented the content, we've got our words, we've got some graphics, we've got some great ideas of interactivity, and we're getting ready to go to get the voiceover done. The voiceover comes later, right? We don't do the voiceover right at the beginning. We do it near the end, right?
Yes, because you want to have your text as finalized as possible before it goes to voiceover, because you don't want to be doing audio pickups later. So, and
Right.
we actually just had a content meeting before this, and Jane was saying that you should never ever do the audio script before a photo shoot. So if you're planning to do a photo shoot, make sure that you get that done first before sending it out for voiceover, because what can happen is you might write in a female character, and at the photo shoot there may not be a female character available. You might have to work with a man, so you need to change all the names, or you might be looking for a certain tool or a certain technique, but maybe that's missed in the photo shoot. So it's got to be done after, just far along as possible.
So that's an interesting point that, sometimes we do a dedicated photo shoot for these things. Sometimes we're able to use stock. Sometimes we use illustrations, and we'll animate things. But yeah, the photo shoot is really useful, particularly for things that are not regulatory. I find things that are really just best practices. So, well, even some things that are kind of grounded in regulations like vehicle inspection, there are definitely best practices, and there are things that people do just out of habit, or that they've developed their own best practices that they don't really think about until you're standing there at the photo shoot watching them do it. And then you catch it and you're like, oh, maybe we should include that. But that's kind of its own thing, because you also have to keep in mind that sometimes they'll miss things. So you almost need a bunch of people at a photo shoot to make sure that you're getting the content or getting the shots that match your storyboard or match what you want to capture, but also it's being done correctly. You've got enough stock characters there that you can have the people standing in the right spot. Yeah, I noticed, Rick, you're a character in Distracted Driving. So I was
which came from a photo shoot from another course.
Yeah, well, sometimes you're standing there and somebody's needed, so you get to be the character. Yeah, so your process then, go to the photo shoot, get all of that stuff cleaned up, and then you're going to go and update your text and make sure your script is correct based on that. And I guess that's also when you're thinking about the actual photos and how much space you have for your words. You probably need to chop it down again at that point.
Yeah, and even as Rick was showing that Stroop test for distracted driving, I believe we held off on audio for that for a while because we weren't sure exactly what we were going to need to say, because it depended on how it was being built.
Right. So the technical stuff and how it gets implemented can drive what ends up happening with the narration. And it's easy enough to go and change some of the guide text that we have on a page to give instructions, but having to get re-recorded audio is trickier. So we always have to balance those things. But at the same time, we don't want to leave it till the very end and have the course ready to go and just waiting on the audio, because they do need some time to turn that around and edit it and get it added in. So there's always that balancing act. And I think you have some of that with audio, but also with some of the other elements like checkpoints and final test questions, which I'm also always fascinated by, because we need to test people and make sure that they're learning, and we need to validate that the learning took place at the end. So I think we've got entire webinars that talk about how to write test questions, but checkpoints are kind of lighter, the more fun things that happen throughout the course. And I noticed that sometimes you guys will both use the regular multiple choice. Sometimes you'll use drag and drop. Sometimes you do a variety of different things to try and get some exercises happening there. So how do you approach those? Do you have a different approach to checkpoints versus final tests, or do you approach them the same and just try to mix up the how they're implemented?
I like to use, well, we can't use drag and drops in the final test.
Right.
So we'll use those as much as possible in the checkpoints. And those are great for when you have lists of things,
Hmm.
a bunch of, for example, PPE and their different functionalities of the purpose, or
Hmm.
just very basic concepts. It can be challenging to write an engaging question about something um, that's fairly simple or not as meaty. So drag and drops are really good for that, where it's more about associating. And
Mhm.
then for final tests and checkpoints, we like to write a lot of scenario questions, and those can help get deeper into the content.
Mm. Okay. Rick, do you have anything that you follow and as a
Right,
particular
right. So,
approach?
I mean, I do keep final test as an entity unto itself. So, looking at checkpoints, um, we've always got one eye on trying to keep breathing life into the course. So, if every few pages is just another multiple choice, it's just kind of it's gonna drag after a while. And so, if you
Hmm.
have the opportunity to spice it up, to use a drag and drop, to use some other element, do that. Sometimes the multiple choice just is the one that matches best with the kinds of content that you're trying to bounce off of.
Hmm.
And then with the final test, Tiff had put in this great resource in our resource library about. Oh, I wish I knew the name of it, Tiff. It is a cube,
You chart.
a conceptual cube. Yes, about um, the kinds of concepts that you want to test people on. You want to just is it straight knowledge? Is it more conceptual? Is it procedural? Whatever it is. And so using those resources to make sure that you've got a mix of those in the final test really kind of makes it more robust than just you know repeat, 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 repeat.
Hmm. Yeah, one of the challenges that I see sometimes in writing test questions is that people want to kind of include a negative in there, like which of these is not the case, which of these is not the thing to do. And that can be very confusing for people when you've got the two negatives in there. And so I know it's sometimes a challenge writing the actual wording of the test question to give viable answers or viable options and to actually test whether or not the person knows the information, not just are they understanding the question, right? Because you may have people with dyslexia or learning disabilities or other things that have to be worked in there, and you don't want to just test whether they're dyslexic. You want to test whether they actually understand the content, and that
Yeah.
changes a whole lot of things, right?
Right.
As a general rule, we prefer to write things in the affirmative, but sometimes you do need a negative question to, like you said, create viable options. So we will only have one negative, so there shouldn't be double negatives. So you couldn't say something like, which of the following is not a best practice, and then have as an option, don't fill out your paperwork, because it doesn't make sense. So if your question is in the negative, then all your options have to be in the affirmative.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, I was at a museum last week that had a really novel approach to that in one of their little kiosks. And they did it in the form of two truths and a lie. And they had three
Mm.
statements. Which one is the lie? So they're sort of handling the negative approach that way without being confusing. So I thought it was really nicely done. Um, and do you tend to test the same stuff in the final test versus the checkpoints, or are you doing it differently? I guess it's kind of based on the same content, so it is going to be similar to kind of approach.
It's
It
similar,
may
but
just.
we'll have different questions. So you won't see the same question appear
Mhm.
in both. It will be worded differently if it is touching on the same subject or the same uh, part of the course. But as Rick said, we do try.
I can rewrite some of the content. to flow a different way? You both nodded on that one.
Definitely. Yeah. That's happened to me a lot. And it also makes you, it's a good opportunity to go back and refine your learning objectives, because we should be testing on the objectives of the course. So it's a good time to go back and check those. And like you said, you might need to flesh out a little bit more content or rewrite something that's unclear, or you might find that there's a gap in your writing or in the research that you need to look into a little bit more, because you could write, when you're trying to write just detractors, you could write a few and then think, well, that could maybe be it. Maybe I need to go back and explain that a little bit better.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly right. Yeah, you will be writing a question and you'll put down a couple of different possible answers, and then you'll think, well, wait a minute, the way I've written it in the course, both of those could technically be true. Is the problem with the way I've written the question, or is the problem with the way I wrote it in the course?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's absolutely a way to a good opportunity to reflect on, have you written your stuff in the clearest way possible?
And one more reason why you don't go to voice too early, because then you would be going back and getting that re-recorded.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. And then I guess once you get to that point where the course is built, you're happy with the content, you've got good visuals, interactivity, you've got your final test. It seems like the course is finished, but it's still not finished yet, because there are also variations and supporting pieces that need to be done from that as well. So in our case, we will have a full-length course, and we may have a bunch of refresher modules that get pulled out of that. We will generally have a put it into practice, supporting activities. So are those things that you're thinking about all the way through, or are those things that you build once the course is completed?
Those, well, for the modules, definitely those I think about as I'm writing, because you might write, especially at the beginning and ending of a lesson, will tend to use words that would imply that the reader has already taken the first part. So for modules, we'll need to write in either a little summary of what, kind of just like a recap of what just happened, or change the wording to make the story stand alone as opposed to being part of a continuous story. And then for the put it into practice activities, if I think of a good idea as I'm writing, I'll jot it down.
Okay. So you sort of build your list of them, and then you can finalize it at the end.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Right.
I don't always, like, sometimes I'll go back, and sometimes I can find, looking at it in the completed state can be helpful to pull out different ideas. But if I think of something on the spot, I just keep little notes. Interesting.
Yeah, I guess for something that's going to have a bunch of variations, you talked about refresher modules, but we also have regional variations as well. So we might have a US and Canadian course that are slightly different, or we might have some regional version or something that's a variation for straight truck or something like that. So you do have to kind of think about those all the way through. And I guess that's part of the initial scoping of what the course is going to be. It's going to be this course, but it's going to have variations for these different audiences.
And when we're building them, in very early in the storyboarding process, your antenna will go off when you see a reference to something Canadian. I'm going to have to do a separate page, and you'll do it right away. This needs to have the US content. And sometimes it's something as simple as using miles instead of kilometers. But sometimes if it's regulatory, it's going to be quite robust, and that's going to take you off on a tangent, and you're going to have to go back several steps and make sure that you've got all the details back into the weeds to make sure that you've got all the distinct, regulatory elements that are proper for the US versus Canada.
Yeah, I know that comes up when we're using stats, usually in the sort of the front part of the course, where we're talking about why it's important and establishing sort of the scope of what we're talking about. We'll often have some stats in there, and you can't always get good stats on both sides of the border. Sometimes you do have to kind of hunt for them to make sure that they're relevant for the audience. So yeah, interesting. And then I guess the last piece is, after all of that is finished and it goes out the door and gets deployed. So when you guys are finished, at that point, it gets turned over to our QA department, who do a technical QA to make sure that it runs equally well on all different browsers and all different platforms, so that we've got mobile, iOS and Android. We've got a couple of ELDs from some of our partners that we test on as well. So they go through all of that, and then the support team will deploy it. But you're still not done, because then you have the language variations that you'll usually do after that as well. So we only have a couple of minutes left, but are there particular things that you think about when prepping to go to a French or Spanish version for a course, other than shrinking all of the English as we talked about before? But are there other things?
That's the biggest thing, but we do need to take into account some of the graphics. So, for example, defensive driving, what we do, and this is actually a really good tip, is that when we're writing in the storyboard, we'll write down any text that's in the image, because we need to get that image text translated as well. So as you're going, keeping a list of all the text that's going to be associated with the slide, even if it's built into an image like a street sign, that will need to get translated. But it depends on where you are, because as we learned with defensive driving, we automatically translated all of the US street signs into English and Spanish, only to realize that in the United States, they don't do that like we do here.
Yeah.
Keeping the text in the storyboard is very helpful, but also keeping in mind what actually needs to get translated.
Yeah, and I guess that's another part of it, is sometimes the actual translation isn't used in the real world. This is what we've found with French, that it's not always translated.
Yeah, and we find that's more of an issue with Spanish, because English is used more prevalently, whereas in Canada, it's more bilingual across the board.
Right. So prepping that translation is not just about saying, okay, here's the document, go translate it. It's also looking it up and figuring out what things aren't likely to be translated, or what things don't have Spanish words, or having some establishing work that the translators can build on.
Yeah, and the pronunciation of acronyms is always tricky. So
yeah, in English as well.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's also one of the tricks. And I remember really having some struggles with that. A couple of years ago, there was a course that I remember Jane was working on, and there was an acronym there that was written out everywhere, but there was no video of anybody actually speaking it. So really had a struggle to figure out, what do people actually say? Do they write it out, or they say it out, or they have some short form? And I think she did finally find one video where somebody mentions it and got the clarification, but that's always tricky.
And that's important, like you said, for English too. So when I was writing TDG, I wasn't sure how to actually, there's like a million dots and dashes and short forms. And
right.
I had to contact somebody from the Transportation of Dangerous Goods website, because I wasn't sure how to actually say the regulation. And so luckily they got back to me. But it's those little things that you don't think about when you're writing that can impact the translation and the voiceover.
Well, and that's going to make a huge difference to the driver going through it, because if they're used to saying it a certain way, and that's just the way people speak it, and our voiceover person does it totally differently, it kills the credibility. They're not going to pay attention. So yeah, we have to stay on top of all of those things. Okay, I think we're going to kind of bring it to the end, because I know we're getting close to time. Any last thoughts? I'll give you guys each sort of a minute or so to kind of summarize your thoughts, or what you think about, or any of the questions that I forgot to ask you that we already agreed to. So before we wrap it up. So Rick, I know you had a lot of thoughts on this as we were prepping it.
Yeah, I mean, well, one of the things I really like is after the course goes out the door, it's true that we're still not done, and the course, I mean, it's got to be right, or else it doesn't go out the door at all. But we'll still do a post-mortem, though not on the course itself, but on our processes. So everything that we've been talking about today, we're going to come together as a group, all the people who are involved in that course, and reflect on what worked and what didn't, right? Are our best practices still best practices? Did we follow them? And did things work for us? Were the bottlenecked? and what can we do differently next time. So that is going to build on and theoretically make easier the next course we work on, and the next and the next.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, also for something like we're talking about today, the non-regulatory courses where there is a lot of best practices, there is always opportunities to refine the wording on things. We will have questions that we think are very clear, but then somebody will have some odd interpretation of it and will say, well, in this time, I thought it was this because of the way you wrote that. And we'll realize we need to sort of clarify some things. So these things end up being kind of living entities that are always being updated. So yeah, Tiffany, any last thoughts on all of that?
I was going to say the same thing, that a course is never done. It's a living, breathing product. And as you mentioned, it has a life cycle, and that cycle sort of, it keeps going and it keeps living. So don't forget about a course after you write it. And
yeah. As you learned with hours of service when you started here and discovered that you're never done with hours of service courses.
Never done. You just got to grow to love it.
Yeah.
It's your baby, right? So cherish it forever. Make sure that it grows up nicely. And I think it's really important, because it's such a team effort, that it's important to just not be too attached to an idea. So you might come up with a great idea, but it might not be the best for the course. And it's really good to remain flexible and be open to all ideas to make the product as best as it can be.
Okay. Excellent. And I think that is a good place to wrap us up here. So I am going to put up my little thank you for attending screen. And then, as I noted at the beginning, everybody, you will get copies. You'll get a recording of this afterwards. If there are any questions, we're always interested in hearing them. Let us know. And thanks, everybody, for participating.